Okay, this is part 3 of the Team Losi Mid-Motor XX build series. As you can see, all the electronics are installed. Basically, the car is functionally complete. I'm just waiting on some thumb screws to come in so I could use those to lock down a battery holder for the battery that will mount here. Although I do notice that when I put a LiPo shorty in here, because of these little ridges, let me get something to point with, these little ridges here in the chassis, both on this side and on this side, that seems to create a situation where the battery doesn't sit perfectly level. It kind of sits sort of crooked one way or the other. Doesn't seem to be a huge issue as long as I can hold the battery in place. If it's tilted slightly in one direction or the other, I don't think that'll be a problem. But nonetheless, I figured I would mount, or I would hold the battery down with like something like this. This is just a Kyosho RB6 battery holder. I have a lot of Kyosho parts, as you know. And just use some thumb screws here. Normally, these two screws here would be some 440 screw length. I think this might be like maybe a 3/8 inch screw that would normally go in here. But instead I use some, I think this is a 3x16 grub screw to hold the back part of this brace down, and I can use this, put some thumb screws here to hold the brace. Typically with the Losi XX, you have these little slots here on either side of the chassis, and you put a Velcro strap in there and you use that to strap the battery down. I feel more comfortable with a brace, but you can go either way. Something I wanted to point out from the last video, when I talked about putting this little spacer in here to brace the motor plate so that the chassis doesn't flex too far forward, and I mentioned that you don't want to use a screw that's too long so that it ends up pushing against the motor plate. I actually realized I was wrong about that, because if you did that, let's say you use from the backside like an 8mm screw to just screw in, you know, this, let me get a longer screwdriver here, hold on, to just screw this piece in here, okay, so that the motor plate, if this flexes forward, it doesn't flex all the way forward because this little piece here is stopping it from moving further. That's fine, but then there's nothing keeping this whole thing from flexing backwards. And if you flip the car over while going forward, the force is going to push this way on the tower, and it's going to cause the whole thing to flex back. So what you really need is to hold this motor plate in place. So what I ended up doing is, with these two screw holes here that I used to mount that little spacer, you screw one screw in, and then with the other one open, through that hole into the motor plate, you get like a 2mm drill bit, and you drill a hole in the motor plate. And then you take a 2.8mm bit, and then you make a slightly larger bore hole. The reason you don't start with a larger bore drill bit is as you're doing this, at least for me, I'm doing it by hand, and if you're off by a little bit, you're going to start shaving off chunks of the chassis, and you really don't want to do that. So you start with a small hole so you have margin to move around a bit, because, you know, handwork isn't exactly perfect. And then once you actually make the hole through this into the motor plate, then you can widen the hole up, because that takes a lot less effort. So then you do that, you screw this in, and then you do the same thing over here. And then after you've done both holes, then you tap the holes that are drilled into the motor plate, okay? And then you put in a longer screw to go through this spacer here, or whatever you want to call this, and then into the motor plate. You can't see it because I've already mounted the motor, but there are actually two holes going through this motor plate that are threaded. And then from the bottom, I use a 3x12mm screw to thread up into those holes in the motor plate, and it just barely threads in there without going too far so as to interfere with the motor itself. And I'm relying on the strength of those threads on those two screws to hold this motor plate down to keep it from flexing back. Time will tell whether or not that's sufficient. I'd like to think that it is, given that your typical mid-motor waterfall part would attach to the chassis with two screws from the bottom. The thing is, those two screws are threading through a big chunk of plastic. Here, there's just maybe 2 millimeters or so, maybe 3 millimeters of metal here that you're screwing into to hold that metal motor plate down. Maybe that's enough, maybe it's not, time will tell. If it's not, then maybe you just drill a third hole, right? Right in the middle here, and you just do it again, and you make 3 holes. The only problem with drilling 3 holes is that now you have less chassis material between these holes. I'd be a little worried about that. I don't want to create any reason for any part of this chassis to crack. So if I put another hole here, there's less material on this side and on this side, and that could be a weak spot for breakage. So for now, I'm just going to use these 2 holes, okay? So, okay, I did that part, and then on the rear here, you see this guy that is not at all phallic looking. The reason for this is to act as a brace for the body. So this is just a Kyosho long ball cup, and you could use any part, but you know, I happen to have a bunch of long ball cups that I'm not using, and the reason for that is when you mount the body still needs a little bit of work. You need something for the body to sit on, because after it's all cut and everything's said and done, there's not enough material back here to really wrap around this body mount piece on the rear tower. Okay, you could do it, but the hole you make would be really close to the back here, and it would likely crack. So you're better off mounting with Velcro along the edge of the chassis, okay, and then just relying on this little bit here, this extension, to just hold the back part of this body up. So that way, if there's a crash or something and the car flips upside down, it's not gonna press the body down and have the body sort of ride off the Velcro down below the chassis. Okay, so it'll help hold the rear in place. And of course, you know, with this body, you do have to do some custom cutting on the rear to cut around the spur gear cover on that side. And then on this side over here, I did some extra cutting to get some airflow in for the motor. Part of the problem here is with this body, you don't have any real openings for air to come in, or at least none that are naturally molded into the body. There's this teeny tiny little nub right here where you can, you know, cut a hole, but that's hardly anything. So where's air going to come in as the car is moving forward? Air is going to come in through the opening on the front of the body here by the steering rack, and all that air has to move back through the car. So if you have fans on this side, so for instance I have a fan here for the speed control and another fan here for the motor, these fans have to pull air from the front and push it out towards the rear and send the heat out this way. I don't know if it's going to do an effective job there. You know, it's going to, if it can't pull in enough air through here, then the fans are going to struggle. And by the way, the reason why I have this fan mounted on the side instead of on the top of the speed control is because the side of this body sits low. I wouldn't be able to fit the body onto the chassis if the speed control were too thick with the fan on top, right? So I have to put this off to the side. So this is another one of those we'll see things. Is, you know, we'll see if this actually cools down enough. If you're running on a high grip track, the motor's going to generate a lot of heat. If you're running a lot of boost, a lot of timing, the motor's going to generate a lot of heat. The speed control is going to get hot. So you got to make sure you have adequate cooling. I don't know if the standard Losi XX body is really well suited for that, because this was made for a rear motor design where the motor is way out here and it's getting plenty of air. Here it's tucked inside the body, in the middle of the chassis. It may or may not get enough air to stay cool over a long run. Maybe for a 5 or 6 minute qualifier or main, it's okay. But for a really long practice run, I don't know. We'll see. Okay, so put the body aside. As you can see, it's painted, but I have to, you know, put decals on it and everything else. So that's work in progress. What else did I do? So we have the rear wing mount and the front top brace. I'll go over the top brace first. So this is made by Factory Works. It's basically a piece that supplements the top brace that you already have on the front of your Losi XX or XXT. And this part, as I understand it, tends to break, if memory serves me correct, it tends to break, you know, like around here somewhere. So what you can do is if you have a broken brace, you can take that and attach it to this guy here, and now you have an unbroken brace, because the brace part still needs to have these little teeth here to go into the bulkhead for this hinge pin to slot through. So you want to keep that front part and just attach this top brace to the front part and then screw it back into these mounts here, okay? But if you have a fully functional brace like I do here, you can use this as a supplement. And depending on what you want to do, Jeff can cut for you different thicknesses of this carbon, or if you want fiberglass, you can do fiberglass also. So this is a thinner carbon fiber plate because I'm using it to supplement an existing front brace. But if you want to have it as a standalone item to attach to a broken piece, then he can make this thicker, like 3 millimeters thick or something like that. All you have to do is just drill one hole through your top brace. I did it here, and it comes with 2 holes. There's a hole over here and there's one here, so I drilled this hole. And just put a screw in with a lock nut on the other side and you're good to go. I decided to put a spacer in here between the screw and the top brace just to spread the load out in case there is pressure applied to this point. The spacer will help to spread that load out a little bit. So that seems to fit okay. I'm not going to be using this body mount here for the body. I'm not going to be cutting any holes in the front of the nose here, so I'm thinking of either shaving this down or maybe I can leave it and it's not really going to affect how the body sits on the chassis. But when you put the brace here, basically it makes it a lot harder to use this anyway because this brace is taking up space here and you're not going to have much room to fit your body clip through that post, okay? Because you're consuming some of the height of that post with this brace. Let's see. Everything else at the front is pretty much set. On the rear shock tower here, this is also from Factory Works. This is made so that you can attach a B6 wing mount to the actual shock tower itself. This is pretty nice because the wing wire that you would normally use in the Losi XX, here we go, the plastic shock tower here, this is a thicker gauge wing wire than you would use for the RC10. And I have some RC10 wing wire, but it's too small. So I don't want to go through the hassle of getting new thicker wing wire and bending it around a wing and doing all that nonsense. Just get the B6 wing mounts and you're all set. Now the thing is, the way the B6 wing mounts are made and the way it, basically the way they're made, you don't get much of an angle. And there's this little insert here that you could put in to make the wing lean a bit more forward. But even with that, with this mounted here, it seemed like the wing was running a little flat or maybe even leaning backwards ever so slightly. I think I might know why. I'll get to that in a minute. But what I did to address that was instead of mounting this wing mount, let's see if I can get better lighting here. Maybe if I do it from this side. And if I move the light down like this. Hold on a second. Okay, slightly better. So these two pieces here mount through holes in the shock tower. Normally these would sit flush with the shock tower. But what I did is I put a spacer here on the back of the shock tower so that the bottom part of this wing mount can't actually mount into the tower. It just pushes against the spacer. You do it on both sides. What that effectively does is it causes the wing mount to lean up more. Okay? And what you have to do, if you put that spacer just on the bottom 2 holes left and right, and you screw everything in, you're going to have to fine tune how much you screw each screw in to make sure that this wing is level, left to right, okay? So it's not tilting too much like this way or this way. And you also need to make sure that it's tilting this way the right amount, also left to right. So there's a bit of fine tuning here with these 4 screws to make sure everything lines up. But once you do, I can get the wing to lean forward a bit more at an angle that's roughly what I would typically expect. Okay? Now, why is it that the wing was leaning slightly backwards, or at least it looked like it was, when I mounted this wing mount? It could be that when I drilled these 2 holes in this motor mount here, that the way they were drilled was maybe causing the rear pivot block to bend backwards just a little bit. And that would have caused this whole assembly to lean back just a little bit. Now, you don't quite see it with the shock tower. The shock tower looks like it's fairly vertical here. But when I flip the car over, or actually, kind of hard to do all this with one hand, but when I look at the underside here, it does look like there's just a very small amount of curvature here where this is curving down just a little bit. And that could have been causing this whole thing to bend back a bit and the wing to bend back a bit. Now, you have to remember, this is a handmade mid-motor conversion. You are going to have some imperfections when you do this. So just be ready for, if you don't drill these holes into this motor mount absolutely perfectly, that may cause the pivot plate to flex a little bit in one direction or the other. Okay? You just have to accept that. Let's see. I think that pretty much covers it. Oh, right. The other thing I did here, just a more minor point, is I tried to map out the timing locations for this motor. What's going on here? Let me get this to zoom in. There we go. So this is a Novak Ballistic 17.5. Nominally, it comes with a sticker over here for 15, 30, and 45 degrees positive timing, but there's nothing extending out to 0 or negative timing in case you want to run the motor in the opposite rotation. So I just took some gaffer tape, and I took a sticker and I put it next to this sticker here, and I just traced out the spacings for every 15 degrees of timing. So right now I have this at 0 degrees timing, and so that way I know it's actually at 0. And it seems to have, has plenty of speed. I'm not really worried about that. I did notice when I tried to set it to negative timing that this particular speed control, even though this is set up to run this motor in reverse rotation, it was having some issues at low speeds getting the motor spinning. There's a bit of cogging or the motor would stall. So if you run into that problem, I would just run at 0 degrees timing, static timing, and maybe play around with boost to make up for the lack of static timing. Again, assuming that the class you're running in allows boost. At the Vintage Nationals with stock buggy or 17.5 buggy, they do allow boost. Okay, that's about 17 minutes to go over some minor details, but I figured they were important enough to share. And what's next? What's next is I gotta rebuild the shocks. I didn't change anything on these. I gotta dump the oil, check the pistons, make sure they're the pistons I want, and put oil in. I'm thinking of doing orange front springs, yellow rear springs, with somewhere around, maybe 35 to 40 weight oil front and rear. I'll probably do 40 weight up front, maybe 30 to 35 in the rear, and that's probably the right amount. And then I think that's about it, other than getting the body ready. So yeah, that's it for now. Thanks for watching.